Welcome everyone to the June 29th workshop meeting, work session of the New Bern Board of Aldermen. At this time, would you join me in a prayer? Heavenly Father, we just ask that you be with us and continue to us your protections and blessings as we do those things that would be in the best interest of our city. In your name we pray. Would you join me in the pledge allegiance to the flag of our country? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Alderman Beasley.
Here.
Alderwoman Harris. Alderman Astor.
Here.
Mayor Outlaw.
Here.
Alderman Kinsey.
Here.
Alderman Best.
Present.
Alderman Odom.
Here.
Okay. At this time, I'm going to turn the work session over to the manager, Mr. Foster Hughes.
Thank you, Mayor. Alderman, tonight we're going to have a discussion and initial review of redistricting, and Alice Wilson is prepared a PowerPoint presentation. We're going to let her lead us through that. City Attorney, have any comments you'd like to make?
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. I hope. We'll go through the presentation. So we've kind of talked about this in January about the statutes that really kind of allow us to and require us to make changes when we have imbalances in our wards and stuff. So kind of the redistricting procedures that we need to, for cities, counties, different cities, there's really no real standards. We don't have to, procedures rather, we don't have to do a lot of things, but we should, probably want to. That's up to the board to decide that. Once new wards are determined, then the city may adopt those wards. Generally, you want to use the same mechanism that you did last time we used the resolution. Then the maps are drawn, and then we work with the Board of Elections rather to ensure they're aware of those changes. So I think we showed this in January as well. There's been a continuing demographic shift over the last 40 years, 30 years, I guess. So this is kind of a quick glance at that. So our last time we did it, we were talking earlier again in January, there was quite a significant amount of changes that we made in 2010 because the population shift had really occurred. We had an exponential amount of growth in that 10-year period, so we had to do quite a bit of changes. So this was just a kind of a look at those changes. So things to consider when we do redistricting, don't try to make all wards equal in population because the city doesn't grow equally by ward. We're going to take a look at that. But so we want to make sure we consider growth. Do stay under, if possible, or do stay under the 10% deviation rule. Make boundaries easy to decipher and be able to follow, like, for example, topography, roads, neighborhoods, for example, make them accessible. And then also look at no retrogression. We want to make sure consider African American blocks as well. And looking at the demographics, we can take that in consideration. So our growth, we again showed this in January, so I apologize for the repetitive, but I think it's really important just to look at the amount of growth. On the left-hand side, these little dots are new housing units that have been built, and some of them are multifamily. So you can look at the numbers there. Just looking at the population, you can see, especially Ward 3 and Ward 4, there's been significant growth in housing units. You all should have like a larger size, there's maps on the wall there, this bigger scale, but you should have a map of this PowerPoint that shows those areas. I took a look at the housing units that in demographic and that were probably around from the 2020 census in April. And so kind of the methodology that I wanted to go over to get these numbers, we took the 2020 or 2010 census rather, and we looked at the residential housing units. There's 800 and some blocks that I looked at. And within each block, I looked at the current, in 2010, what was the current occupied housing unit, and what was the total or estimated person per household in that census block. So I took the housing units that probably were occupied, most likely occupied, or could have been occupied in April of 2020, and I'm sorry. So I took that information and used that methodology to go through all the 800 and some blocks to make sure to get an estimate. So is everybody kind of understanding the methodology that was used to come up with the numbers? So if my estimates are right, we're probably right around 33,000 people at our census, our last census, if we've got good counts. So I want to adjust those amounts. As you can see, I'll go back a little bit. We can see in Ward 1, there's a significant undercount. There's a significant difference in population. In Ward 3, it's quite the opposite. There's quite a significant amount of growth that we've seen. So kind of looking at some changes for each ward, we'll go through them, and please stop me if you have a question about it.
I have a question.
Okay.
Before you go any farther.
Sure.
So with the methodology that you use, did you take into consideration for those people that moved out of our city for the Hurricane Florence hit?
Yes.
Okay.
So we tracked all so I map also the building permits. So I looked at demolitions. We also looked at houses that were in minimum housing code violations or were abandoned, that kind of stuff. So yeah, we took into consideration those as well.
And let me just add, so we're all on the same page. This is just a working model. These are not real numbers. These are just,
Yeah.
these are best guesses so that you guys can start thinking about how the wards might take shape.
Are we allowed to talk about them as she goes?
Of course. Yes, ma'am.
Because Ward 1, I don't agree with remainder of Craven Terrace. Ward 1 doesn't have any Craven Terrace, so that needs to stay in Ward 2.
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
Yes, ma'am. Alice is not quite there yet. I just want to make sure we understand
Okay.
how these numbers are working. They're estimates. The real numbers are the only ones that count, and we'll have them late summer. So we're just trying to get everyone thinking.
So it could be shifted a block here or a block there based on the way the numbers come in.
Absolutely will.
Yeah.
So we're just trying to get some broad brushstrokes on it so that we're not starting from zero at the end of the summer. Okay?
So we're just taking a look. So again, my estimates, we should be at 33,000. We might come in way under that, or we might come way over that. So like I said, there are 800 and some census blocks. With the 2020 census, there's actually almost 1,000. So there's lots of room for adjustment. So this was just a first dry run, if you will. So changes for Ward 1. Let me put my old lady glasses on. Again, this was the lowest. 2020 estimated population, my methodology anyway. So because Ward 3 is already way over, to take that area that's in Township 8 and give part of that along the Country Club Road on the east side of Country Club Road into Ward 1, and as well as part of the Ghent neighborhood. And then suggested gain was, and we can have this discussion, the remainder of Craven Terrace, we've lost, you were talking about housing count, so there were several, I think 4 buildings in Craven Terrace that were demolished. So that number of population went down from the 2010 census. So, but that certainly, that was just a suggestion. And then there's an area in Ward 5 that is suggested, a portion of the Paveytown area, that we merge that area in Ward 5 because that is all kind of a neighborhood area.
Well, let's see, I know this is just a discussion,
Yeah.
But that right there, trying to put that back into Ward 5, I think that would fall under the lines of retrogression. I don't think that that area needs that type of, I'm just going to say, that Paveytown area. It's, why put it back into an area that's already, I'm going to say, challenged income-wise? Why put that back into that? Put that back into that area. Now, wouldn't you classify that as retrogression?
Let me field that, because this
Okay.
is a great segue to kind of talk big picture again. We're trying to accomplish 3 primary objectives. step one, we want to equalize the wards, right? In terms of human beings in those wards, not by party affiliation or age, just how many human beings are in these wards. And while we're doing that, we've got to get those numbers within about 250 or 300 people of each other between the minimum and the maximum. So we don't take the 30,000, divide it by 6, and say every ward must have 5,000. That's a good starting point. But we've also got to be looking for growth over the next 10 years. So what we do is we take the growth areas and we'll make those wards a little bit smaller by population to give them room to grow over a decade, because more likely than not, like we've experienced in the last decade, they're going to grow robustly, and we don't want things to get too far out of kilter. So we're trying to start with a median number, anticipate some growth, and then legally we have roughly a third of our population is in the minority community, roughly 30%. There are 6 board seats. A third of 6 is 2. So we've got to have 2 wards with a majority of minorities, right? We can't dilute the minority population so that there may not be any minority representation on the board.
That's usually 2 and 5.
It's 2. It's typically 2
Yeah,
and 5.
yeah.
It doesn't have to be anything. It has to be 2. Which ones they are, it doesn't matter what number we put on them, but it means that we must have 2. And to say this out loud so it can sink in, because people think, well, 3 would be better than 2, but we don't have enough minorities to create a majority in 3 wards. There just aren't that many bodies, right? So those are the building blocks that we're looking for.
But when we do this, though, doesn't this create the data for the next census tracts that could be used for grants and opportunity zones?
I'd have to research that. I
Yeah,
don't-
because we did the census tract for the opportunity zones, and the governor voted on it, and majority of the census tract was from Trent Port area and downtown. So with the new census, now it's new data. We also have to think about the income, don't we? Yeah, we have to look at that in regards to minorities in the census tract too, don't we?
Our redistricting won't have any effect on that. The census folks, and actually they work with the county and the states to define census tracts and census block groups. Usually what you're talking about is like a block group. They look at block groups, and we can put in input at the beginning before the census even occurs. And the census has certain standards that when a census block group or a census tract reaches a certain threshold, they'll split it. So in the 2020 census data, we've already seen that, I think there's like 5 or 6, like around the Township 7 area, has been divided in like 3 different new block groups, because it's grown so exponentially that they define that if I think it's 4,000, I want to say off the top of my head, if it reaches a certain threshold, they'll automatically divide that census block or that census block group. Because when they send out census staff to do the counts and stuff, they don't want to overwhelm the staff that'll be doing that. And it affects the numbers that they get. The tracts won't change, but the census block or the block group will likely get split.
And that's different from a ward boundary.
Right, that has nothing to do with our redistricting.
At what point, this is just a question, because I remember the point came when we had to add the 6th ward. At what point of population growth do we potentially add a 7th? I'm not saying that's anywhere near the future, but when do we get to that point?
That would be purely a political question. There's no legal issue.
Okay,
You
so
don't
if
have-
we
you don't have to
decide
have
that we
6.
don't want more than 3,000 people in a district, we could potentially create a 7th ward.
Right, or cut it to 4, or make it 8.
Okay, I was just curious, because I was curious, I remember it, but I don't remember it. Mayor, you might remember when we went from 5 wards to 6 wards, and that was because of Greenbrier, when Greenbrier came in that area. So I was unsure how that came about and what drives that decision. At what point do we feel we have too many people in a ward?
Sure.
I mean, you look at Ward 3, what we're proposing to make all of Township 7 and 2 one individual ward. The way that it's growing right now, that might be, it'd have to be 2 wards down the road. So, yeah, that's certainly, in 10 years down the road when we have to do a redistricting, that you can certainly talk about. And if you look at our ECJ, as we're expanding out where Ward 6 is at, we're going all the way to that Highway 17 bypass. That's a large area to cover. So when we start to develop that and that starts to be part of the city, that might be where you say, we've reached so many square miles that we might want to consider that.
To
I
wait
would
for
think-
10 years though would, if we're looking at it now, it makes sense to look at, every option because 10 years from now, the wards might kind of be overpopulated in that area.
Scott, I know you represent other cities. Do you represent any city probably not larger than New Bern, do you?
I don't.
I'm just curious, like Greenville, I think Greenville has the same number of board members we have, and obviously.
Well, I was gonna make that very point.
Yeah.
Raleigh, there's a lot of major cities
Right.
that are divided into wards with 6 or 8, commissioners or aldermen, depending on the town. So there is no magic number as to how many constituents can one properly serve. In some cities, you'll have 50,000 per ward or more.
Can you imagine those phone calls? Well, these are all good things for us to know as we plan, because we are the future and looking to the growth of our city and, how it's going to look and how it's going to be served and how its constituency is going to be served. And I think that's really important, if that ball is in our court. And I agree with you, Virginia, we should maybe look at it. I just didn't know if there was rhyme or reason to how that happens.
Yeah, our redistricting will have no effect on census tracts or blockage or anything like that.
One question relative to that, Scott. So if we just decided, well, we think we should have an additional ward because of that, would we have to add 2 because of does the state statute tell us it has to be an uneven number or?
No, but I'd have to look at the statute to see if it's a charter amendment that we can do as a matter of right or if it takes a local bill. I don't remember. Thank you.
All right, I think the only thing I didn't talk about in the proposed Ward 1 was the Township 2, just to make sure that, as Scott was saying, we want to stay within 250, 300-foot threshold. We would probably suggest to give that to Ward 1, or Ward 3 rather, at this time. Any other questions on this one before I go? All right, Ward 2, I know we've already had discussion about moving Craven Terrace into possibly Ward 1. As I mentioned earlier, we would take Ward 3 out of Township 8, and that remaining area that's north of Trent Boulevard, we would suggest to put into the Ward 2. There's also a little pocket up here along Elizabeth Avenue that's currently in Ward 4. When we did the 2010 census, trying to get those numbers just right, we brought that little L-shaped area, I think it's Laurie Drive and Elizabeth Avenue, into Ward 4, just to give them the numbers. So we would probably try to clean that up so that you don't have neighborhoods or streets that are split. So any questions or discussions on potential Ward 2? All right. Just looking at the proposed developments that I'm aware of, and one of the reasons why we're moving things out or moving things in, Highland Village Apartments, which is right behind Camden Square Apartments. There's a 60-unit multifamily project that's under review, and then 801 Carolina Avenue Apartments, which is an 84-unit multifamily project that's under construction right now. So we see growth occurring in that in Ward 2.
Now, for those questions, right, do we know when those units in Ward 2 would be filled over on Carolina Ave? Because we have an election in March, and if the seats aren't filled, that's a loss for people to vote in my ward if we're just putting empty buildings in my ward to fill up numbers or potentially having people there.
No, ma'am. Good question. I'm glad you asked that question. The census data is going to be live human beings living in a place.
Okay.
Yeah, this is just to look at future growth, so we might want to, we don't want to put too many new people to put you over or too far over, because we know more growth is coming. This is just, this will not count towards your census numbers. We're just like as Scott said, whatever happened to April 2020, that's the only thing that we're going to be looking for as far as redistricting.
But the point Alice is making is that we have to have an eye on that as we consider which wards to leave room to grow and which ones not. Those are the kind of things that we think about to leave room to grow.
And as Scott was saying, we don't want to cause retrogression, so we want to make sure when we're looking at where we're seeing population occur, that it keeps our balance. So Ward 3, that place is just exploding with development. And it's already way over as far as population, so we would bring all of that into Township 7 and Township 2. New developments that are going on right now, we have Lakeview, which is also used to be called Far East Farm. There's 104 homes going in there. Blue Water Rise, there's 267 homes that have been approved. Verdant, Bayberry Park, there's 77 homes that have been approved. Hudson at Carolina Colors is an apartment complex that's under review. That's 360 units. And then Carolina Colors Independent Living is 155 unit senior and independent living apartments that's currently under construction. So you can see they're already over, and we see continued growth. And so, like I said, 10 years down the road, what is that going to look like? So we don't want to, they wouldn't, if they're under count right now, then that's okay, because we know they're going to grow. Any questions on proposed Ward 3?
Alice, just for that future planning discussion, can we get from Development Services the number of breakdown of units of apartments? So if there's a 1-bedroom or a 3-bedroom, I would think that would come into play with the calculation.
Yeah,
360 units is a lot. I mean,
right.
It's a lot of people if it's 3 or 4-bedroom apartments versus 1-bedroom.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure we can go through the site plans and take a look at that. But you're right, yeah, that could have an effect on the number of persons per unit. Then look at potential changes in Ward 4. I will say that right off before I even say this, I think I've already would like to step back on one of these, and that is the area that is what you call the West New Bern area, where the 43 connector goes through there. I originally was thinking that it would make sense to have, talking about keeping neighborhoods together and how development might affect one side or the other. But if you look at the ETJ and how it's defined, that if we created this and we gave this to Ward 6, it would kind of create Ward 4 as a kind of an island where it's cut off from future growth. And if you look at the ETJ in Ward 6, we can see that there's a lot of area that's undeveloped that at some point most likely will be developed. So we might not want to consider that, but I'm open for discussion on that. That was just a thinking. And so like I said, there's no population in there right now. There are 2. There's the common apartments that are under construction right now, and then there's a subdivision that's going in right beside it. And then as well as Derby, well, in current Ward 4, there's a Derby Park that's under construction, a new phase of it for 68 homes. And then the Tate Commons apartments are under construction with 58-unit multifamily. So, any discussions or thoughts on that?
In Ward 6 and Ward 4, obviously there'll be growth out toward the river bend, but it's more about the 10-year projection of how phenomenal the growth might be in the Craven West versus the more trickling townships of Ward 6 all the way to River Bend. Jeffrey, you know out your way, you know about what your absorption is with Craven versus President Johnny Ray or Harbor's area, the Craven West. I mean, that's probably going to have a higher unit number in the next 10 years than, I mean, that's just something to look at is the number of units. Johnny Ray doesn't have, or if it's if that area's gonna stay in 4, there's not a lot of area for growth in Ward 4. It's not a lot of infill left, right?
Right, well, so that's what I'm saying, and, we might want to reconsider that and make the highway the divider, and, so that he or Ward 4 can expand in that direction as Ward 5 as well. So I don't want to cut them off. Ward 4 is pretty dense, and they're also way over population, not way over, but they're over the, optimal population. So if we leave that, knowing that, the common apartments and the subdivisions that are proposed in that area, we might have to make some adjustments and give them to Ward 5 or Ward 2 to kind of balance that out.
Ward 5,
I
guess.
was,
Go ahead.
no, go ahead, nope.
I'm good.
Because I was gonna say, literally, across the street is Ward 4. It makes no sense, so, and majority of Ward 4 is over where, H.J. McDonald is. So why doesn't Ward 2 have all the way out to that street where Southland Bernie Road is? Like, that area, why don't I have that area? It's like, I'm just caught in everything, and I live over here, and it doesn't make sense to me how trying to redistrict, we want to kind of like get it in a proper viewing of how it should be. Because on this side of the street, it's me, across over there is Kinsey, and then you have Odom. So I'm just trying
It's
to.
that way, same way, like in Ghent, I stop at one street, and then it was the third that was over there. It's just,
It's very confusing
it is
for residents, and
confusing.
it makes sense
Going
at
down
this
National
time.
Avenue, on the left side of National Avenue, once you get to Blades, Barbara, is that you, Blades Avenue? So that,
Yes.
yeah, that, so, and that is confusing to the residents over there, because it's somewhat broken up.
Yeah, there is one area you can see along Lori Drive and Elizabeth Avenue I talked about earlier, bringing that out of Ward 4 and putting it into Ward 2 to kind of clean, because there is a neighborhood that's split right there, so make it easier to define what Ward we're in.
It's like coming down Amherst, it's the same thing that you see.
Yes.
On one side of Amherst, and then it's just 4 little houses in it.
Right.
And then you come down,
Kings Road,
no,
I think.
Pine Tree Drive, you come down Pine Tree Drive, you go all the way up. Okay, all the way up to the complex over here, then you come up to Elizabeth Avenue. Yeah, Elizabeth Avenue. Then you turn onto, I can't think of the street right now, Family Dollar's at the corner. On one side, Longview. On one side is the 4th ward, then on the other side is the 2nd ward, on the same street.
That's the case, almost all the wards.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
I mean, except
you have to
for-
split them
Right,
at
but
some
we're
point.
saying
Yeah.
at this time, since we have 10 years and we're doing this, it makes sense that now we can get this map to look a lot more cohesive and better understanding and equipped so that residents have an understanding and we all have an
You just-
understanding.
I don't know how you would do it. I mean,
Yes.
boundary
Well, that's
lines,
why we're
there has
here.
to be boundary lines.
Yeah.
And on the boundary line, on one side of the road, it's gonna be one ward, on the other side, it's gonna be the other ward. The only exception to that is gonna be Ward 3. Ward 3 is gonna, the river is the boundary line, and anything over there is gonna be in Ward 3. I'm the only one that doesn't really border any other ward.
Yes, you do. You touched me over
Yeah, but
here.
they're coming.
That's coming out.
That's coming out.
I will say when in 2010, when we did the redistricting, there were, like you said, a lot of neighborhoods that were split, and there were a lot of significant changes. When we did it in 2010, we looked towards the eye that in 2020, and it really has conformed to that. We saw areas that were going to grow a certain amount, where other areas were not going to grow a certain amount. And so we tried to look so that we wouldn't have such significant changes in 2020 as we did in 2010.
The points you're making are correct and good points, and they're good observations. You want to Alderwoman Harris's point, you want to use highways and major streets to divide things up whenever possible, right? Those are bright line, easy things to do. You want to avoid splitting neighborhoods because it's confusing. But other than those two mileposts, the population and the physical locations are going to drive what you end up doing. If population didn't matter, we would just do it all logically. But we've got to get to these magic numbers And the two big no-nos that we try to avoid is we try to avoid and want to avoid creating islands within a ward. You don't want one ward lying within another. Bad idea.
Like what used to be in Taberna with
Yes,
Ward
sir.
Two.
Yes.
Exactly. So
Or
you-
2, 6.
Yeah.
You
It
want
was
to
a little bit
avoid
everywhere.
islands, and and then, right, similar to that is you want to avoid these streets that bisect a ward. Like Alice was pointing out, it's not an island, but it might as well be because you're just running a street through the middle of a ward. But avoiding those two no-nos and then trying to honor highways and rivers and major features, once you leave those, you're going to have every situation where one side of the street's one ward, the other side's another. There's no way around that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, when you have a neighborhood with 2 wards, that means you have 2 aldermen, which means you have 2 votes.
Yeah,
So-
yeah, sure. That's a good point.
All right, we'll take a look at Ward 5. That's probably physically next to Ward 3, the largest in area changes. So again, talked about a portion of Katy Town from Main Street north to the railroad to Gray Street and east to Burn Street, bringing that in from Ward 1 to Ward 5 to give them some more population. There is the Tyler Homes on the lake, which used to be called Lake Tyler, which is right now has 337 homes that have been approved, and they have been building quite a lot over in that area. Any questions on that or comments?
Not at the time,
I'm sorry?
not at this time.
Not just now. And again, I mean, I'm gonna reiterate, and I think Scott's reiterate, this is just a
I know.
best guess population, so I'm no doubt whatsoever that these numbers are gonna change and these areas are gonna change. This is just trying to look at the bigger picture, I guess. Then last, but certainly not least, Ward 6, again, the only change really is that bringing that, on the other side of the highway, and that it really is a defined area, that a major highway going through there. It makes sense that maybe we leave that. Right now, there is no population. I know Alderman Harris was talking about population. There is no population. Even though there's construction right now, we can't count population because during the census, there would have been no population there. So they're, changing it from one ward to another really doesn't change the population numbers. It's just a thought process, I guess. There's still major projects that are going. Bell Oaks is under review for 60 homes. West New Bern, there's 63 homes that are in review. And then, again, the common apartments in West New Bern, we probably won't include those, but if you look at the maps that you have on your desk, if you look at the ETJ area, we look at Crayburn Forest or other areas that, like along Rocky Run Road or whatever, we hope to see development out that way. I think it's once that the 43 connector south comes, I think there's no doubt that we're going to see growth in that area. Any comments or questions on that? Actually, he's the only, or Ward 6 is the only one, I think there was in 50 population right now, just looking at it, within being optimal, so it's pretty balanced. So what's the next steps? We should be, of course, this is like a moving target, be getting the redistricting data. They're saying by August the 16th, it'll come in a legacy format, and if you thought filling out your taxes were bad, getting census data in legacy format is 10 times worse. So it comes in kind of like a spreadsheet thing that has these columns that have all names that are 30 miles long, and you have to try to figure out what those names, the census folks trying to be helpful have some test data out there that we can go and take a look at to try to. So come August 16th, when we get that data in, because in September they're going to release the easier user-friendly data, but we don't want to wait till then. So when that data comes in, we should be ready to go to look at the numbers, see do we need to challenge those numbers. There's a small window this time to challenge, and there's a small category where you can make challenges on if you don't agree with the population. There's not many. So they're really anxious to get this data out there and being utilized. Yes, any questions about that, of the data that's coming out?
Do you have the numbers, because like Scott said, 2 wards have majority of the minorities. Based on, the preliminary information that came in, does it show that it's changed from what it already currently is in regards to which two wards have the majority minority?
No, because New Bern is under 50,000 people population. Our estimate as far as demographics and stuff like that is kind of limited, so we can't get block group or block level data. If we were a Durham or Raleigh or Charlotte, something like that, we could, because they send out more surveys every year. But unfortunately, we don't. The only thing we can do is base it off like the housing and what we think the population is going to be based on the number of housing units by each block.
So how will you know which ward is the minority ward if it doesn't specify based on?
Well, we won't do anything, as far as finalizing and bringing it back to you until we get those numbers in August.
Okay.
And then we'll have a very clear picture of what we think the population and the demographics for each.
So we would assume at this point that still 2 and 5 are the minority wards.
At this point, yes.
So then Alice, based on the population, for the 2020 census, the information we're waiting to get back. So at that particular time, I just said Ward 5, I had a lot of vacant land over there, vacant lots, okay, no houses on it, okay, no structures, because of hurricane damage, right? They're classified as FEMA lots now.
Right.
There's not gonna be any growth on those lots.
Right.
So now how are you gonna,
We took that in consideration in our in my methodology. I've since Florence, I've been tracking that for FEMA and other purposes, as well as I track the building permits and stuff like that. I've tracked the demolitions and stuff like that in our GIS system, so I took that in consideration.
but how are you gonna manage when we do get the population numbers back? I'm at a standstill in Ward 5 because of a lot of lots over there of FEMA, green space. So you know there's not gonna be any development there.
Well, haven't been considered FEMA lots yet. I mean, there
There's a
are.
lot already over there that's classified as.
Well, there's some in the Duffyfield area,
Yeah,
that in
right,
Sunnyside area.
exactly, right,
And
exactly.
those will probably be at some point as part of the redevelopment commission, we will probably utilize them for stormwater control. But there's other areas that we're like Northfields Drive, for example, that we're looking at possibly, but, I'm not sure what that process, and that won't take effect anytime
Exactly,
soon.
exactly.
I think I understand the question you're answering, and Scott, maybe you can help. This does not have to do with square footage of land or anything. It's based on people. So while the development might not be in the FEMA lot, the development's in Lake Tyler, the development's in those places, and those are gonna be heads on beds, basically numbers. That's what they're gonna look at.
But there's a number already set for those areas.
Not
For is the-
necessarily.
I'm
If you-
I'm talking about for the building.
You would have to look at, so I did look at zoning as well. So you look at your ward,
Okay.
you're almost like 2.5 times size Ward 4 in land mass.
Right,
And he's way over.
right.
So you have to consider, as that area expands as far as 43 connector and stuff, and I foresee that area will continue to grow.
So.
Whether
at
it's
that point-
multifamily, if you have a multifamily unit or development, that can have significant amount of housing units.
So what about you just said about the, stormwater, because I know the redevelopment or development services came here with the projects and the whole buyout program that could take, 5, 10, 15 years. That land is, you're doing it based on the 2020 census. If that land is bought out and people leave who were counted on the 2020 census, because I'm thinking about 10 years, and the land is not developed, you can't develop it, doesn't Ward 5 kind of lose out on that growth in those areas because you're turning these areas into stormwater features where it can't be developed?
Well, we can't look at that now as far as the census and redistricting. We can kind of think about it, and look at it, but we can't, because we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah,
It's like saying we've got a piece of land here that's prime for, development of some kind. We don't know in the next 10 years if that, unless we have, the only thing I'm showing you right now is approved plans or projects that are currently under construction. And those are the only thing that I'm gonna be focusing on as far as redistricting.
Yeah, we're confusing two different concepts. Step one is we've got to balance the wards based on the 2020 numbers. That's step one. Step two is we want to look forward for a decade and try to maintain some kind of parity best we can. Now, there's a version where you might say one ward's going to grow by 2,000 people in the next 10 years. But all we can do is give that ward at most 300 more, less people now to give them some trajectory. We can't give them 4,000 now, hoping to hit 6,000 in 10 years, because today we're being measured, and we've got to be within 10% of each other.
No, I understand the concept. I'm just saying, over in her ward, over where Trapper's Trill is, just say the residents have the first meeting, say next year, and they're like, yep, let's buy out. They were put on the 2020 census, and now they're no longer there, and that's never going to be developed again.
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, for me, I don't know, it's just a little frustrating for me that Ward 2 and Ward 5 have a lot of drainage issues and flooded areas that will never be developed, and they're turned into waterways and water parks, and I don't know, that's
But you get your population then in other areas.
Exactly.
So you might lose 10 people or 20 people from this area, but you're gonna have to pick up. That's what they're saying by projecting, you may go
Yeah,
5
I
or 10%
understand that.
over.
I'm just
It has-
necessarily just kind of making a comment in regards to the drainage issues and things of that nature, and hurricanes and stuff that happens, people getting flooded out so many times, FEMA properties. You can gain as much property as you want, but the wards, how they're created for the 10 years is what I'm looking at, 10 years of having a solid ward.
Understood, but you could gain 500 people on the west side of your ward, but you might have lost 100 on this side, but it all balances out. I understand what you're saying, but at the end of the day, the government, everybody looks at the end number. So let's just 30,000, 5,000 people per ward, 10% is plus or minus 500 people. So either your ward's going to have 4,500 people in it, or it's going to have 5,500 people in it. So it doesn't
But
matter what your land
we
mass.
get to determine that, though.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how you get to that. It might be that you draw the circle bigger, you draw the circle smaller. The end result is that and Alice, she's very good. I'm thankful I went through this process once before, and I remember we had a lot of the same discussion. And so what we did one day is myself and another alderman, we were concerned about our areas. We sat there, and she's got this great map, and the alderman would say, well, I want this area here. And she'd click on it and say, okay, you now have, 4,700 people. And now your ward has just lost 300 people. So, and that's how we would do, click back and forth till we got the numbers, and we agreed that we were at the numbers legally, and we were satisfied with the boundaries. So there are tools that she'll be able to help us with. Do you still have that tool, I
Oh,
see?
yeah, I mean,
Okay.
software, but I think a good example of what you're talking about, Alderman Harris, is like in 2010, Ward 3, we put Old Town, down Country Club Road, part of Ghent in that area, even though we knew there was development for Taberna, Carolina Colors was coming in that 10-year time frame. But as Scott said, we have to go based on that census. And we can't, we can try to adjust it as best we can, but we still have to make the wards a balance for that time frame, that time stamp. We have to make the wards balanced now, not what might occur down the road 10 years from now. We certainly want to adjust the boundaries to be thinking down the road, but we can't say, okay, right now, we're going to take all of Township 7 and make it into Ward 3 when he's going to be, 600 or 700 people short. We can't do that. Because we lose that equal vote, one vote for each person.
Alderman Odom, do you have something?
Scott, not that I would advocate doing this more often than every 10 years, but can redistricting be done more frequently?
I asked myself the same question. I don't know the answer to that, but I was wondering about that, and I don't know.
The other thing that, and maybe I'm just oversimplifying this, but you've already identified that we're going to have 2 minority wards, which is what we have now. That's not going to change. And we've got the 10% rule that we have to stay within.
Yep.
So am I just oversimplifying this, or is this process really should be just very simple? We should just be moving some lines to base off of the population growth that we've had and the regression that we've had in population, say, since Florence. We've got to move some boundaries. The reason I say this is, some of you may have seen there's an email, there's a group that's advocating to host these calls to talk about redistricting, and they're looking at the political changes on that has nothing to do with us.
It does, though, because you're dealing with representation, and you have to think about the census gets everybody that's in there based on your race, age, everything. So Ward 2 right now may have majority, but we don't know if that's going to change to Ward 3, Ward 4. We don't know what the new majority wards are. You have to look at demographics based on that. So representation, you want to make sure that there's representation.
And
in
we
the
will.
wards.
I think when the census number
that's
comes
correct.
in, we'll make sure that either 2 or 5, or just say if it moved to 1, that there will be 2 minority wards.
You would not want to your point, which is correct, you would not want to design a ward knowing that very soon growth would dilute out a minority majority.
Right.
That is not the result you want.
And even though we don't have to do the pre-clearance again this year or this time around, the Department of Justice is still there, and they're gonna, if someone raises an
Absolutely.
issue and says, I'm concerned that, they're making all the wards one, taking them all out of minority, then they can go to the Department of Justice and sue and say, we don't think this is fair and balanced, and the Department of Justice is required to take a look at that.
And one of those individuals I was going back and forth with, he brought up Riverside and Ghent, that it was split during the last redistricting of the wards. But from a state legislative standpoint, our wards have no bearing. The state doesn't look at a ward of a municipality and say, okay, well, we're going to do this or that. It has nothing to do with that.
In theory, it should be, once we meet the legal criteria, balance and address the racial issues, thereafter it's about governance.
Right.
It's about what communities are more like the other in terms of governance, which areas and geographies have similar issues, so that one person can adequately address those
The historic
issues.
districts. So when we
Right.
District 1, we
Yeah.
took Riverside, Ghent, and downtown because they were all historic
The last thing you need
districts.
is 3 public officials who have to get smart on HPC rules. But yeah, that's kind of the macro view of it.
So this is not my desktop, so it's a little weird and having wireless connections or something, I'm not quite sure. It'll take a minute to come up, but we've got the maps here digitally, and we can take a look at some areas if you want to, or I'm not quite sure how you want to proceed. Or-
Yeah, let's kind of hold the board here for some direction. What we want to accomplish tonight is to get these good questions out of the way. So now we're all understanding the basic rules. And then with those rules in mind and these maps just for illustration and thinking about, you guys can be reflecting on what makes sense to you. Alice and I are going to give you advice to make sure that we can check the legal boxes. But thereafter, it becomes a question of governance. What is the best way to govern certain areas that make sense? Recognizing there's no version that is perfect. There will be hundreds of streets that get split because there has to be a border between 2 wards. There's no way around it. Going forward, we could do this again. I think just from listening to you and your good questions, Alice and I have probably accomplished what we wanted to accomplish, and here we are, call it early July. So we're 6 to 8 weeks from having better numbers. I don't know that it's a good use of your time to start sliding streets and blocks around at this point. I think the more thought you can give to the general regions that Allison is outlining would be helpful. And Alice, I'll look to you and the board. Do we think it makes sense for you to have some digestion time, and maybe we meet in early August or mid-August? We still won't have good numbers, but we can start giving Alice some feedback on some of the more macro visions that she's proposing.
Is it possible, like, say, 1, 2, and 5, because we really touch each other, maybe for the three of us to have a meeting and
Absolutely.
get together?
That's a
and
great idea.
Talk about that and say, can we move this here, can
That-
we move that, maybe, and then get a couple, and then, just switch around, and maybe we could talk to each other that way, it
That's
might be
a-
easier.
I like that thinking, and you guys know the rules. We can't do quorums, for sure. And what I do want to avoid, which I have found is not efficient, is to meet in onesies with staff. Because we just start moving lines and erasing, and then we're not making progress. But I like the idea of putting together aldermen who've got common border lines to start thinking through those issues, because that's how it's going to get resolved.
And that's what we did, it was 1,
Yep.
2, and 5 that met
I
the
like
last
that
time.
thinking.
And we kind of worked at, we had the majority of changes at that point, and that's kind of,
I-
and
I
that
do.
made everything.
Is there any need to even begin this until we get the numbers? I mean, you move something, you might have to move it back.
That's true, but, well, I mean, it's whatever.
I'll defer to the three of you in those wards to decide if you think that's going to be productive or not. If there are some major visionary differences, then maybe the sooner you sort those out, the better. But recognizing that you don't need to get down to the granular level of different streets at this point.
And I agree with Alderman Harris on, like, Craven Terrace. So Craven Terrace was in the first ward 10 years ago. That came out of the first ward, and some other changes. And I think, we could work together to kind of, and same with Alderman Best, to kind of shore some of these things. It was the same thing like in Riverside. Maybe we can shore that up a little bit better to just make it easier for the voters. And like here where we suggest part of Ghent going to the second ward, maybe it would be better to keep it all whole because it is a neighborhood.
Yes, ma'am.
Again, I don't know. It would depend on what the population is
Yes,
there.
ma'am.
If I pick up 50 people there, I have to lose 50 people somewhere else. So where does that go?
Why we're being mindful of the demographics. Yes,
Right.
ma'am. Exactly right. So here's a thought. Alice and I have homework. We meaning Alice, will put together some information on the growth areas, hot spots, maybe get some more details. Alderman Odom was asking about, when we talk about apartment complexes, how many bedrooms, just to get a little more vision as to where Alice is thinking the growth is going to be. So we could be doing that in the meantime. As you want to have breakout groups among yourselves, that's great, do that. Alice will be available to you. And then, of course, we'll be seeing each other in our board meetings, and if anything changes or we have different ideas, we'll have this conversation again if we need to as we move forward.
So I gave y'all on your desktop the copies of the maps that are up there, and also on the PowerPoint, so you could have a bigger version of it. One is the current wards as they are today, and then one is, just kind of looking at some initial thoughts on changes.
Scott, just two comments. I think you were kind of looking for some grand overview. Alice, when you look at the change from 4 to 6 with West New Bern, with things such as sewer capacity and future development in Ward 6, I think that Highway 70, as it is now, is a good dividing line. I think what you're going to see south of Highway 70 moving into Ward 6 would be more commercial based, which would not have populations right along the corridor. And then there's some new houses that's going to continue in Craburn Forest area. So I think, and give Ward 4 that ability to expand.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of wetlands around Craven Terrace as well, so there's going to be a limited capacity as far as housing development, or any development really. So.
And then the last thing, Scott, again, I'm not trying to oversimplify or dilute this process, but, and I'm not advocating for this, but if the city were to decide that we don't want wards anymore, and everybody would be voted on at large, we would still have 2 minority representation based off of population.
Depending on how one organizes the election. gonna be, I'd have to think that through.
What I'm trying to get across is there's nothing that we're gonna do by moving a street one block over one direction or another that's gonna dilute the minority representation, because that's gonna be driven by the population that comes in on the census.
Yes, sir.
And it's gonna be 2 wards.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Correct.
Relative to this question, just a step beyond that, is there anything that we need to do based on the email we got with Senate Bill 722? Do we need to say when, we know the election is March, the runoff potentially April, May. Do we need to set the fact that we would then seat a new board at the end of June? I mean, is there something that we would need to do on that and have some discussion?
Let's do, yes.
Okay.
In the coming meetings, let's talk that through.
Okay.
That would be very helpful. The other thought I had too, a lot of you asked some good questions. And for example, if you have the projected growth issues, Alice is probably in the best position to talk, to understand that. But in terms of buyouts or areas that may lose some population, do feel free to reach out to Alice directly and individually.
Which could be minority, which could change. That's what I'm saying. I get what Alderman Oldham is saying. I understand the concept and the process. But you have to think not just today, tomorrow, you have to think the 10 years. There's 2 elections within this census when we do it, right?
Doesn't matter, you can't, the government says you have to be at this number now.
I'm not saying that, but there's still 2 elections that will happen when we change this.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
To give you a silly example, if we knew that an area in a ward was going to be bought out and 1,000 people were going to leave New Bern and they were minorities, we need to understand that and
That's
adjust
why-
for that.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. But we can only, the crystal ball is
Do
only.
so, right, we can only do so much, because even when you go to like this, housing complex, Carolina Ave, we can't assume that all minorities are gonna fill
No,
it
ma'am.
just because
No, ma'am.
majority of them may have come from
No, ma'am.
Trent Court. So
Precise-
it's like,
Precisely right.
okay.
But Alderman Bingle is correct. We've got to deal with these current
Yes.
numbers.
Yeah, I understand that.
And leave all the room we can to move in the right direction.
Right, that's the point, that is not simple, and that needs
It's not.
to,
It's not.
the discussion,
And it's
once
al-
we get the numbers
yeah.
in August.
So Scott, what you're saying is, we don't need to have Ward 2 and Ward 5 with a 50.5%
No, sir.
minority
Right.
majority.
No,
There
sir.
needs to be more cushion
No,
there
sir.
to account for that.
And we have,
Right.
and there's enough numbers to create those cushions
Right.
so that we don't disenfranchise anyone.
Gotcha, that's all, that's one of the things I'm concerned about.
Question, so when I became an alderman in 2009, we did have an orientation process back then, by the way, and I hope there'll be one in the future, but we were handed this nifty, gifty, it was a street atlas, and it listed every street in New Bern, what ward it was in, how you get to, and it's been a great reference for me. But Alice, is this something you could, I think the board members, would anybody like to have
I would
this?
like to
I
have
put it on
that.
my to-do list. So.
Yes, I mean,
It has to be updated though, right?
Oh, it does, that's what I'm
okay.
saying, I mean, a current one,
Okay.
no, a 2021, but it's got and it's color-coded based on your ward, and it says that, but it's really easy to find a street or something, it might help in this process.
Yeah, it is true, it is online though, too.
I know it's
But there
online,
are
but I'm
some people
not, I
that
want
like
a
it.
piece of paper, it's hard to see it, old eyes is hard to see,
And
I like
sometimes
paper.
that system is down. so
Yeah, and then
you
at
need
least
to-
you can find, and look, it shows you the streets really good, so.
Scott,
Jeff, I hope your internet goes down. I hope you have Suddenlink.
I have 2 maps in my office, so.
Yes, sir.
Scott, how long does a person have to live in the ward before they can run for the seat?
You
60
have to be
days.
eligible to vote for the seat that you're running for. That's the simple
So
rule.
they can move in
Yes, sir.
and be there one day and
You get your mailing address, you open your
When did
utility
that
accounts.
change? It says on when you have to be there 60 days.
Oh, is that?
Yes, it's either 60 or 90 days that you have to be in your ward to be able to get on the ballot. The last time that I
Is that
checked
for
and
voting
read it.
though? That's just for voting,
The
right?
state
Not
statute
voting,
provides
for
that
you, when you go and it tells you the criteria to be able to run for an election, I saw that it said 30 to 60 days in your area.
and that may be the voting rule. The
Yeah,
statute,
that's
the
voting.
statute defines qualification for holding office as being qualified to vote for the seat that you're running for. So it may well be that you have to live there for a month or two to even vote.
And what
Right.
establishes a permanent address for a candidate?
Their physical home address.
The
Primary residence.
Your domicile is where you live and where you intend to remain, but you can be temporarily dislocated. You can be at your lake house for some period of time and still live at your primary residence. Those are tough factual questions, but the legal answer is simple, the practical answer is tougher.
Yeah, because if you don't live in your ward and you clearly moved, you're sitting in your seat
You've
illegally.
got to be able to vote for the seat that you're in, which means you've got to be a resident of your ward
Right,
to
and
run
so-
for office in your ward.
But
Hypothetically,
you
if that
can be-
happened,
You can be, I remember this happened a while back. You can be elected, living in your ward, be elected, and move out of your ward, correct?
No, sir.
You cannot.
You cannot.
So if you're not
Then you have
living
to
in your
resign.
ward, you cannot be an alderman.
that's correct.
That's correct.
Interesting.
That is why the second ward many years ago was in Taberna, one street in Taberna.
I understand clearly.
So we had an alderman that lived in someplace and bought a piece of property
Yeah.
there, was thinking they might move there. So
I
one street
thought,
was in the
I
second
was,
ward.
because I thought that's what happened to, I don't even know his names, but does that same rule apply for the mayor?
No, the mayor can live anywhere
The
within
mayor
the
can
city.
live anywhere he wants to,
Yeah,
but can he live, once he's elected,
In
can he
the
move
city.
outside the city?
No, sir.
No.
No, sir.
Okay.
Got to reside where you're qualified
Didn't
to
that
vote.
happen one time?
Not that I know.
Yeah,
of.
not that I know of either.
Okay.
Because his vote is at large anyway, right?
That's right.
Yes.
That's
But
right.
I was not I was not aware that if you did not live in your ward, you could not be an alderman.
That's right.
Yeah, you have to live in the ward that,
Yes, ma'am. All right. Are we good on that issue for the time being?
7 more questions.
All good stuff. Alice and I are available to you. Can you just let us know? I understand that you may need a closed session pursuant to 143-1511A6 to discuss a personnel matter.
So
Yeah.
moved.
Second.
Motion and second, is there discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same. Motion carries.